Welcome to another episode of Jews and the World. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and today I have a guest who I think did an amazing, I don't want to say feat, she's going to tell you about it. Her name is Rebecca Klein Ault. She lives in Washington, D.C. and La Jolla, California. But we're going to talk about a trip she made to Germany and her amazing project to clean 100 Stolpersteine, which we're going to explain, in 3 days. And she surpassed her goal by 111. But Becky, tell us what you did, and then let's talk about the origin of how you first learned about it and why you became involved.
I recently returned from a trip to Munich, Germany, and my commitment to the city of Munich was to polish 100 Stolpersteine. This is my second trip of going to Germany and doing this. My first trip I took in Hanover and committed there to polishing 62. So I knew that 100 would be attainable and reasonable. So that was my commitment, and I exceeded it. And I exceeded it on two fronts. One, I had some help from Terry Schwartzberg, and he helped guide me along the way and let me know about the Stolpersteine and my way about Munich. And because we were at one point at a place where there were 14 Stolpersteine, and Terry said, "Look, there's 14," and he was excited. I said, "Terry, we shouldn't be excited that 14 people lost their freedom right where we are standing. We should seek to find ones and twos rather than a whole family, extended family, friends and family who were taken from that exact location." So once I get to a place where there's 14, I don't stop at 100. I continue until I get that whole group, that cluster polished.
I'd like to add something here to explain perhaps Terry's enthusiasm. Well, first of all, I have a special feeling for Munich because my husband and I were stationed in Munich with the U.S. Army from September 1970 to May 1972. But the reason Munich is a very interesting city, because although Stolpersteine, which we're going to explain more in a minute, are all over Europe and other places where the Nazis murdered Jews and others, because Stolpersteine can be from Rome and Sinti and others also. Because the Jewish community leader in Munich is this child survivor, she has been rather, I don't want to be polite, unreceptive to Stolpersteine, because she doesn't, and there are people who agree with this, don't think people should walk on the names of Jews. So Terry has been, I don't know how to say this, but running a campaign because he thinks it's very important to remember the people in Munich. So I will just say that the way I met Terry is I was in Munich in 2022 in the summer, and I was Egyptian Museum, and I couldn't understand why there were Stolpersteine inside the museum. So I looked up online, and that's when I connected with Terry, and he explained to me on private property in Munich, you could put Stolpersteine, even though you couldn't put it in public at that point. And so that's why I think we should say that Terry was excited.
Yes.
Because he feels very strongly that those, we're going to explain the brass square plaques. Becky has an example behind it. We're going to tell what it means. Are there. Okay, that was a long explanation to explain why he might have been excited.
Yes, and in Hanover, that city has a civil courage department that supports the Stolpersteine, and they are in the middle of the public right of way. So I found myself cleaning there in the middle of the sidewalk and people literally tripping over me. And in Hanover, it was very interesting because the city is so supportive of this and this initiative. And there's a website that has a lot of information, and they've got a team researching those people, where they lived, and getting those Stolpersteine placed. So yes, it's quite a different environment. There are over 300 in Hanover, which is a smaller city, and Munich has shy of 300, and that's a large city. And then if you look at a city like Frankfurt, there's literally thousands of them there. There's over 110,000 Stolpersteiners all throughout Europe.
Should we explain now what it is in the amazing man, not Jewish, I say this, usually I don't say this in my show, but I really want to give him credit, who started this amazing project. And I even understand it wasn't legally at first, but okay, we're going to skip that because he's so amazing. Go ahead, Becky. You tell about
Yes.
that.
So Gutu Demning, is an artist, and he wanted to find a way to memorialize the locations of where people had lived. And he's got, imagine a 4 by 4 inch square, and it's a brass top, and it starts out saying here lives, and it puts the name of the person, and it puts their birth date, and then what became of them. Some of them fled to the United States, so not all died at the hands of the German
Your
Nazis.
collaborators.
Some of them lived many, many years. In fact, one that I cleaned in Munich is a man who left Germany. His parents were murdered. They did not leave Auschwitz. He joined the United States Army. The Army sent him back to Germany as a translator, and he was the psychiatrist translator for the people who were on trial at Nuremberg. So he lived until, I think, 2012. So he lived a long life. There's another man who lived, his stone is in Hanover. His brother was a boxer. And of course, they didn't want any issues with a man who was a professional boxer. So he was murdered right away. But his brother lived. But when they started to sense that his brother might be causing some problems for them, he left as a cripple. That's the stone that I have behind me. You can kind of discern the word cripple in German. So he did live, but what life do you have when your brother's been murdered and you're a cripple? So he lived, but it wasn't without any trauma or implications of what had happened to his family. You pointed out earlier, they were not all Jewish people. They are people who resisted in any way, shape, or form. They didn't even really need a reason for that matter if they didn't like you. But the majority, and not to diminish, were sought out because they were Jewish.
The story you just told about someone who survived. So my project, Thin Edge of the Wedge, which is a nonfiction Holocaust play, is dedicated to Henry Einstein, who was a civilian who worked in the military intelligence unit in Munich that my husband worked in. And he was sent to safety at relatives. His mother survived, very complicated story. His father was murdered in Auschwitz. So he also and came back with the American Army, and he was a translator at the Nuremberg trials. And my husband's civilian boss, Lucian Kempner's father, Robert Kempner, was a deputy prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. And so Henry Einstein worked for him. So when we were in Munich, we lived that history. And I have found now that, so through the internet and posting this tribute to Henry, people have contacted me. I've been able to trace it. And yes, there are stones now for Henry and his parents. And the way Gunther explains it is the last place they lived of free will.
Yes.
So it's the house where Henry lived with his parents before they sent him to safety in America. And I'd like to add something else. Yes, I'm interviewing Becky, but there's something interesting. Why what she did was so very, very important. So my daughter Yael and I were in Prague on a different project, a film project we're working on in May 2023. We met with a British man expat, who is polishing stones and started this whole project in Prague. At first, he felt uncomfortable. He wasn't Jewish. He said, how could he do it? Then he saw a video of a non-Jewish man in Salzburg who was cleaning stones, and he started. But it never occurred to me, I'd seen them before in Europe, that brass tarnishes. And Trevor said, when he came to Prague, he couldn't read those stones. So I want you to understand, audience, how important what Becky did, but I want to tell you something else that Trevor did that was genius. He noticed that the way they were laying the stones, so the brass is attached to kind of like a square piece of cement. In fact, Elle and I met the head of the Jewish community in Prague, and he showed us all the ones that were going to be installed. And they were laying them right next to the edge of a building. And he said that dogs were doing their business there.
Yes.
And that no one saw them. So he encouraged them. And now in Prague, they're laying them more farther out in the sidewalk so they can be seen better and the dogs aren't doing their business. And I thought it takes an outsider to notice that. But what Becky is doing, I can't tell you how important it is. Because otherwise, if they can't be read, what use are they?
That's absolutely right. When I was in Hanover, I was given an address. I stood in front of the storefront, and there's probably 6 feet of public right of way, or what we would call sidewalk. And I would look right, look left, look up, look around, and most of the sidewalk is made of square stones, maybe not exactly 4 inches, but stones. And I would look and I could not find the Stolpersteine that I was there to clean. And I looked again and I thought, where is this? And it's because they do tarnish. They are exposed to the elements. They are weathered. And as most people who deal with brass at all know, it's always going to need to be polished. The work is never, ever done. And on that point, we should never forget these people. We should never forget their names. We should never forget their lives. We should never forget where they lived. So after I polished, so I have before and after pictures of every place because I wanted to record, and that was the best way to capture the address, the location, the names on the stones. Afterwards, I'd stand back about 25 or 30 feet. I'd take a picture, and this is glowing like it's gold. So the polishing work is never done. I don't know what the duration is of time,
I was going to
but
ask you, what do
someone
you
in
think?
Munich said to me, I'm glad you're polishing these. She said, because it makes them so shiny, and they are very, very shiny when polished. And she said, people have their dogs doing their business there. So I have my little cleaning kit. I bring United States Brasso. I use a small amount just because probably not the best thing for the environment. It's very effective. I put that around with gloves on over the entire stone. So it's 4 inches. It's not huge. I have a soft scrubber and I use that. I don't use steel wool or anything that's abrasive. I take a paper cloth and paper towel and wipe off most of the Brasso, put a little water on it, and then get a microfiber cloth and polish it, dry it all off, and it's shining beautifully. Um, so it's a pretty easy process. I think I did 60 in Hanover, and it took me, cumulative time. And this is walking between the places because it's a great way to walk around the old cities because the concentration of the population was in the old areas. You're not going 5 miles out of town. You're right there, and you can walk one block, another block, and you can see the density of the people and where they lived in their ways of life. So it's very easy to do. And I would recommend for anyone who's coming from the United States, it's a great opportunity to learn history. It's a great opportunity to come back and look up the names and see who that person was. One was a woman who was born on my same birth date, so that resonated with me. Another one was a woman who was a violinist. There was a person who was a seamstress, which kept her employed in the work camps, making clothes and taking care of things. So she survived. Again, the boxer. And when I was in Hanover, the woman in the civil courage office asked me if I would give special attention to Herman Fetterman's Stolpersteine. He was a 10-year-old boy. His family left him in Hanover when they were able to leave because poor little Herman had epilepsy and other disabilities. So he was kind of dragging down the family's progress in trying to get out of Germany. They left him with several different groups of people. And when he was eventually taken by the Nazis, he was taken to Brandenburg and he was in the T4 program, which is euthanasia. So the day he arrived, he didn't even get another day in his life. So they all have stories, and the stories are their lives. And it's important for us to learn these things. And I think any school-age child who's over a certain age would find this interesting and manageable. I think in, I don't know, 7th or 8th grade, we all read about Anne Frank, and there's a Stolpersteiner in Amsterdam for Anne Frank and her sister. So there are people who we've heard about and a lot of people who we've never heard of, and it just gives an opportunity to learn more.
I just want to say to people, we've been using the German word. It means stumbling stones, in case you wonder what word we keep saying. But I want Becky, just before we start, to tell why she became interested in And she has German relatives, and I asked her, did that impact her decision to do this amazing volunteer work? But Becky, tell her what you told me, because it was very interesting.
I live in Washington, D.C., and we've been kind of at a conflux of drama, for lack of a better word, for several years. And I think we're all being appealed to find something in our hearts that tug at our heartstrings, and that we can, if it doesn't affect us personally, that we can be an ally of and an advocate for people who are not as well off as we are, not doing as well, and haven't had the same opportunities we've had. And some of it's a little too close to home for me to do it if from the workplace. And I was at a point in my life where I wanted to travel. And it just came together on a trip where I was going to seek out art of another artist, and ended up in Hanover and looked for more artists, and then came across the Stolpersteiner and the Office of Civil Courage in Hanover. And I said, hey, I'd like to help any way I can. And they said, good, come here and we'll provide you with the cleaning supplies and you can clean Stolpersteiner. And it was just so interesting to me that I booked a second trip. And as soon as I came back from Munich last week, I booked another trip to go to Cologne and Frankfurt, which I have to say, looking at the map of Frankfurt and the Stolpersteiner, there are so many, I don't even know what goal of quantity I could set for myself. It is amazing the number that they have there. And that city also has two occasions during the year when they actively get a lot of them cleaned. One is November 9th and 10th, and the other one
That's
is
Kristallnacht for people who want to know. The Night of Broken Glass, but in Germany they call it Reichspogromnacht, meaning the
yeah.
Reichspogrom. German.
And the other is in the springtime for the Jewish Holocaust Day.
Yeah, not so it's in May for Yom HaShoah with the date, or April. It changes according to the Jewish calendar. We've just, I don't want to use the word celebrated. I want to say mark that this year it was Sunday night, May 5th, and Monday, May 6th, but the date changes according to the Jewish calendar. Whereas Kristallnacht doesn't change its date.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say that for Prague, Trevor Sage has created a map, and you can literally go on and look up the different addresses and exactly where they are. And I assume that some other cities, I'm not sure whether Terry has that in Munich or not.
They do. Yes, yes. In fact, if you look up Stolpersteiner, you will find any in a city, you put Frankfurt, Cologne, Hanover, Munich, small cities, large cities, you will likely find a site that lists all of them, a location, an interactive map, the information that they have acquired, because they don't just put down they won't put a stone just because you say Joe Smith once lived here. They actually want to be accurate and informative and considerate in memorializing where the people were last free to live.
I have a dear friend here in LA whose family Nussbaum. Most of them survived through interesting stories, but she and her children and grandchildren just went to the ceremony for their family in September. And she was first amazed at Gunter and amazed at the research they did. They had found deeds of her parents' or grandparents' homes, etc. So it's very moving. We highly encourage people who, not just your relatives, but I had wanted to do it for Henry Einstein until I found out he already had it. So to do this, and you have to get your name on the list. Obviously, there's do this to commemorate people. But I wanted to just say something I was thinking about a few minutes ago. I was thinking, why did he choose something that needed to be polished? And then I thought, actually, the advantage is that they need to be polished and therefore reminded. So that Trevor Sage in Prague took my daughter and I around to some of the ones he polished for us as an example. He puts the picture up, you know, now that we all have tablets and stuff, he put the picture up, and he wasn't just polishing. He was like really reliving. And what's interesting is a woman came out of the building we were, and she said, oh, I've heard about this. I'd like to get involved. He said, that doesn't happen so often. I said, well, it's interesting. It happened today when we were here. So the more people hear about it, which is what we're trying to do today, the more people do become involved.
It was interesting to me to see the number of people who just carried on about their way. Some would stop, some would speak to me in German, and I know very little German to be able to converse with them. Uh, but it was interesting to see the number who just kept about their business, just kept going. Uh, and interestingly enough, the one stop I made, a man came out and he said, "I knew you were going to be coming because Terry had mentioned that I would be stopping by and cleaning." Uh, his where he lives, the building, it's up on the step before the doorway. And I was asking him, "So what do you know about these, or how does this resonate with you?" And he said his parents were Nazis. And uh, he said, "You have to understand, there was a time that if you were not with them, our family would have been just like all of the others." So I consider myself fortunate that at that time, my parents aligned with what they needed to, because if they were resistors, I probably wouldn't be here today. So everyone has a little bit of an angle on how it happens and whether they're fortunate or unfortunate. And I think at this point, we're fortunate that there is a way that you can see right where the people were living. You don't have to come to, for example, in Washington, D.C., the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. You have to come here to see that. It's no place else. So it's a nice sentiment that it's where we did our business, where we were living, where we were last, just to remind us that these were people, there were lives that they were leading, and their lives were cut short. Their
So,
freedom was cut short.
so to clarify, that it's this particular one was on the steps, right? So that's how they got off public property in this particular case. Is that
Yes.
what you meant?
Mhm.
Interesting. In Munich. This is not necessarily elsewhere. Yes, I've just finished reading a book. Can't even remember the title. I read so many books, but I find this man's statement interesting because there's active Nazism and then there's just being a bystander. So he was making a point for why his parents were active, I think. So I think that's interesting.
Or to what degree they were. When I was in Munich, I walked through Shirker's Alley where you could bypass having to give
Oh,
it. Yes.
go ahead.
Yeah. So I
Oh,
saw that,
wait.
and
I
the
want to explain
proximity
it.
was exactly bypassing where you didn't want to have to go.
Yeah, I think it's right. So, okay, it was there in 2023. I know exactly what you're talking about. I didn't know when I lived there. It's right near the Opera Platz, whatever it's
Yes.
called. And there's a place where if you walk the normal street, you'd have to give a Heil Hitler. So I didn't know it had a name called Shirker's Alley, but it's a little alley. So if you go this way, you avoid giving Heil Hitler. Yes.
Mhm.
So that's what she's referring to.
Yeah.
Uh, everyone's story is important. And that's why I think this is this whole Stolpersteine movement campaign is so very, very important because it makes the people real in a way that isn't real for lots of people. I know that Terry did an amazing project the other day, recently, in which he went to a high school and laid out the map of the area where they lived and had students use their GPS somehow and actually plot where in their neighborhood Jews had lived. And again, that makes it real. They're not people in concentration camps or the Holocaust by bullets or starved in ghettos. Not that none of this is not important. That's not what I'm saying. But real people who lived where they lived, to pass that same corner every day, that it just hits you, right?
And you wonder to yourself or to others. So here's this seamstress who got deported and lived a few more years in her life. What about her husband? If he was a merchant in the shop on the ground floor and was providing goods and services to thousands of people in their Munich community, what if he would have lived? What if they would have had more children and those children grew up and led long, productive lives and had more children? You think 6 million people dead, and what that does to the whole fabric of the lives we lead today and where all those people would be, what they could be contributing.
So in 2016, Yael and I were in Berlin, and I met with a Hollywood, I mean, he doesn't live in Hollywood, but an agent for Hollywood projects, for film projects. And at first I didn't understand what he was talking about. He was talking about, he didn't use the word brain drain the way we would use it, but how Germany in, he was 2016, was still affected by all the loss of all this creativity. Not that everyone in the world is creative, that's not, and at first I had no idea what he was talking about. And then because I'd never thought of it that way. And then I thought about when you chop off a very contributive part of your society, even though not such a huge number, what that does to the culture of a country. And then he explained to me about the Russian, it's called the Russian ticket, which I thought was very interesting, that after 89, Berlin has invited a lot of Jews from Russia into Berlin to try and kind of rejuvenate that culture. In Berlin today, I was just talking to someone on another podcast who said he's Scottish, but Berlin is his favorite city because there's this feeling of creativity and liberation, etc. And that's what was lost. And I think it's really interesting that Berlin has been trying to regain that. And it's impossible to regain everyone, but still making, okay, now I'm gonna get upset because of what's going on about campus. I'm not talking politics, but campus protests, making the other comfortable, making the other part of your culture, and not outside your culture, but bringing in the culture. I'll never forget when we lived in Germany. I went to Ludwig Maximilian University to try and learn German. It was kind of like an Alpan, like in Hebrew, where we only spoke in German. Not that I knew any German. And a Turkish woman was in the class. Her husband actually worked as a mechanic at the Kaserne. That means the post where the army was. So she invited me over, but we only had German as our original language, which we really couldn't communicate in. But that kind of cultural diversity of including different people is so important. And how do we encourage that, Becky?
I think at this point, we just need to reach out and embrace people who are not like us and include them in what we're doing. I am not Jewish. I have friends who are Jewish. And when Terry heard that I was coming to town and it was during Passover, he said, join us for dinner at the home of friends of mine. And I was like, oh, what are we going to eat? What am I going to do? What am I going to say? And it was just the experience to take it all in. And that's the second time friends who are Jewish have invited me to Passover dinner. So I think, I'm not exactly going to invite everyone to Christmas dinner at my house, but when those opportunities present themselves, rather than saying, I'm not sure I've done that before, I'm not interested in that, to kind of seek out and find opportunities to expand your thinking and understanding of others.
Do we have an idea of how much, I forget how much it is to have a single stone lane, but it's not exorbitant at all.
No, I think it's 120 euros.
Yes, depending on the rate of the euros. So, I mean, to dollars.
Right.
So I say that only because I want people to realize it's not a huge investment. And really, my friend who went in September, it's a small village whose name I can never remember, outside Frankfurt. The whole family was thrilled. And the mayor gave again, there is another advantage in these small towns. I can't speak for large cities, but it's reminding cities with no Jews now what it was like, not just what they lost, but to honor what the past is, to honor the cultural heritage. And so that meant a lot too. And I know that, I was thinking of another example, but anyway, so by doing this, I'm trying to encourage people two ways: to have your own stones done for relatives or friends you're encouraging this learning. But to do what Becky's doing is so important, to encourage others to learn. So Becky didn't have, because I asked her ahead of time, any direct person with connection to any direct stone. She did this, I don't want to say goodness of her heart, which is true, But for an understanding of how, and now I'm speaking for Becky, maybe I shouldn't, we have a responsibility to the past to preserve people's memories and to preserve history so that it doesn't happen again. So when you manage to say it didn't happen, and now we're not even going to talk about Holocaust deniers, and it opens up the way to make it easier to happen again. And when you remember what happened, it makes it hopefully harder to happen again. I don't think we have an assurance of that, but I think it can help. So you've given us a lot of time. I really appreciate what closing thoughts. Again, let's just go over again. How can someone listening to this think, oh, I want to do it, but I wasn't sure from Phyllis and Becky's conversation, what should be my first step, especially if I don't have any one?
Well, I think if you're planning a trip to Europe, many countries, not all. I don't think France has very many.
That's
Other
interesting.
countries have a lot. Germany, Poland.
Holland.
Yeah, this just look up Stolpersteiner. There's 110,000 of these. Go to the city that you're planning to tour and see if you can find some. Take a little bit of Brasso, take your polishing equipment, or contact the person who's in that city if they have a civil courage office or an office that is working with these types of projects. They have the equivalent of Girl Scouts and other high schools and student groups and civic organizations who do go around and polish these. Sometimes it's organized and regularly, sometimes it's infrequent and as people come around, but it is a good experience. It's very interesting to walk around because you take in a leisurely pace through the old parts of the city, and you can just see where there's a shop today, there was a shop then, and there were people living above that shop. And if you have a relative who needs a Stolpersteiner, you can complete that application and pay that fee.
I'll give that URL at the
And it
description.
is a small brass stone, about 4 inches. It's implanted into the pavement on a piece of concrete, so it's not easily removed or going to have problems. It's not, although they're called stumbling stones, they're not elevated in a way that you
Right.
would
I
trip
always used to
over
think
them.
it.
And if nothing else, tour around, see where they are, look up the person whose life was being lived there, and learn something more about that city in kind of a grassroots way.
Absolutely. So I will provide some of the URLs that will be helpful, including the one I think I'm going to check with Becky that hits our 1-minute one showing her in a different places, polishing in Munich. So wait, so when are you going to Cologne and Frankfurt, your next trip?
Yes, over Thanksgiving week. So the weather will be a little colder. So prepare for the weather. On my list of things to take, I also took with me like a gardening knee pad because
I was going to ask you. Right.
you're on the pavement and you want to take rubber gloves because it's the sidewalk and it's not necessarily clean, but it is something that anyone of just about any age can manage. It's not difficult at all. And do take pictures to memorialize the occasion.
And share the pictures. But wait, I want Becky to hold up in front of her the notebook because she wanted
Oh,
to, that she showed me. So
so
show us.
I wanted to be
Oh,
sure
right in front of you.
that
Yeah.
I remembered. And I took a right as rain construction workbook so that if it was raining or got wet in my pocket or with the cleaning supplies, and I wrote down the address, the names of the people whose stones I polished, the ones who have S's next to that, because when I came home, I'd look them up. If they survived, I put when this Stoppelsteiner was put in place. And it was very interesting going through and reading about the people and their lives and how they were living before. And some of them managed to survive in some of the work camps for a really long time. Some of them perished just days before uh, that camp was freed.
Liberation.
So there are lots of lives to learn about.
So I can't thank you enough, Becky. Oh, coming on the show was great, but really, it's so encouraging given all the very disturbing news that what you've done, we would call you an ally, but an ally to history and to preserving history. But with what is it called? Your own grease? What is it called? That expression in English, we say elbow grease, elbow
Elbow
grease.
grease. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just think you're a wonderful, wonderful person
Yeah.
and a wonderful example. And I hope that she's encouraged others of us. I'm not sure I can get down with my bad knees, but I
Right.
always, in any city that I am in Europe, I do always try and find the Stolpersteine and honor those people. So it's very important. Thank you so much. Be
Thank
well.
you.